Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Pawncast. Hopefully, y'all are enjoying the episode so far. This episode is going to be a little bit different because I kind of want to take a step back and talk about a documentary that I have recently watched. It's on Netflix, and as y'all know, I'm a huge WWE fan. We're going to be talking about the Mr. McMahon documentary that just came out on Netflix. So, spoilers for those that haven't seen it yet, highly recommend. It's on Netflix. I'm sure there's snippets of it that you can go out there and watch. Also, disclaimer too: there may be some things that we're going to be talking about on this episode that may be a little bit uncomfortable for those that are listening or watching. So, just kind of full disclosure. But yeah, let's get into it.
All work, no pleasure. I ain't here to make friends, big stepper. Hey, bad guy, Heath Ledger. Ready for wherever, I'll be front and center. Don't fly too close to the sun, your body chopped up by propellers. Came in arrogant, but left out in a stretcher. The comparison, y'all know y'all couldn't replicate it. Chilling in the desert, I'm good under pressure. Stick around with me, hold it down, look at what we found. This a marathon, not a sprint, let's go 100 miles. From the ground with me to the clouds, never coming down. That's a crown on me, wear it proud, show 'em what we bout. Stick around with me, hold it down, look at what we found. Said this a marathon, not a sprint, let's go 100 miles. From the ground with me to the clouds, never coming down. That's a crown on me, wear it proud. What they was talking about.
So, what I like about the documentary is it kind of talks about Vince McMahon before he kind of became like this wrestling guru, if you will, because the first one kind of really hit home because it talks mainly about him and his relationship with his family, in particular his dad. As a kid growing up, Vince had like a stepdad that would beat him and all sorts of stuff. Well, his dad, Vince McMahon Sr., already had pretty much WWE going, and Vince was obviously growing up into the business, and I guess basically just wanted to kind of become a big part of that. Obviously, before WWE became as big as it was, everything was set up in territories. You know, you had Mid South, you had all of those territories. So WWE wasn't really as big as it was before, obviously, what it is now. So Vince, basically, as he grew older, basically bought out his dad's share of WWE and started becoming basically this big promoter, if you will, and pretty much started taking over. He was on commentary for a little bit. I think whenever his dad was still over the business, he was a commentator. He didn't really feel like he fit that role of commentating, and and bought out the shares from his dad. So he started taking over, and then he started kind of expanding. He started taking talent from other territories, if you will, like Road Dogg. I think he even took over Hulk Hogan at one point. I mean, he just started taking all the Roddy Piper. He started taking all of these talents from these different territories and started, creating characters. And I think a lot of the characters back then, in particular, the biggest one was definitely Hulk Hogan, and just started creating this character. And obviously, times were different back then. It seemed like Vince really was honing in on like the American side of wrestling. That's kind of like a line that you kind of cross whenever you uh, combine entertainment with public affairs, if you will, like what's going on outside in the real world. So, we had wars going on and things like that. So for Vince to kind of take Hulk Hogan and basically make this American icon, if you will, and just kind of run WWE, well, WWF at the time, back the way it was huge. Of course, the American always had to win. Couldn't have guys like the Iron Sheik, uh, be the baby face because it was always the American that had to win. So yeah, no, definitely was interesting episode. The first episode, how he kind of came about and he started kind of taking over, these territories, kind of buying out the talents, kind of creating these characters. And what I do to like about it too was it kind of brought, so all of the interviews on the documentary are basically from like 2021. So basically like 3 years ago that they were interviewing. I mean, they were interviewing, Stone Cold Steve Austin. They were interviewing Trish Stratus. They were interviewing The Rock, Undertaker, Hulk Hogan. So there's a lot of big names that went into this documentary. Paul Heyman, and rightfully so. So yeah, so we gotta get into the business side of it. Like I said, I eat this stuff up, and then we start. Even back then, I mean, this was before my time. I grew up in the '90s, so this was before my time. But even back then, Vince and some of the people at WWF, they were really like there was quite a bit of scandals going on. There's quite a bit of allegations going on. Even back then, there was allegations with Vince, and then they had there was another one too where they had there was this they had a sex scandal going on with the Ring Boys, the basically just the underage teenage boys that would set up the ring. So yeah, there was quite a bit of scandals going on even back then, compared to obviously what we know now. I mean, obviously, Vince can pay it off. I mean, it looks like it was kind of pretty much, kind of settled in court. There was even a big one too that before Hulk Hogan decided to leave the company, that he was actually going to be on the stand against Vince. Because there was also another one for steroids. There was a big, obviously back then it was pretty much a no-go that you couldn't really have any type of performance enhancing drugs such as steroids. And it was crazy to see that they had basically Hulk Hogan on the stand against Vince to basically say, hey, was Vince pumping, talent with steroids? Was he doing it on, was he forcing people to do that? And some people, I mean, this is just a fan from the outside looking in. You look at these guys back then. I mean, you can't tell me that none of these guys didn't have steroid use. I mean, even if Vince did it or did not do it, I mean, these guys were jacked. I mean, you look at guys like Rick Rude, Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Ultimate Warrior. I mean, the list goes on. You can't tell me these guys. I mean, yeah, obviously they went and worked out, but that these guys were freakish athletes, even without the steroid use. So yeah, a lot of scandals. Looks like even back then, like I said, quite a bit of heat on Vince. Even back then, even while trying to just come up out of the territory game, taking all the talent. But yeah, he definitely had a lot of heat back then. There was probably one of my favorite, probably the next two episodes, like episode 3 and episode 4 of the series. And by the way, each of these episodes are like an hour long. So, and then there's 6 episodes. So, if you got 6 hours to kill, I mean, this is definitely a good way of doing it. But I mean, I think I split this up about two or 3 days, kind of watching these. But yeah, no, the third and the fourth one I definitely liked a lot. So the third episode is called Screw Job, and this was definitely, even it's still talked to this day. There was a kind of like a blur between reality and actually and just straight up entertainment because this is kind of like WWE at this point is trying to figure out who the next guy is, who is that next person, because ultimately whenever we think of WWE at the beginning, it was Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was the man. Um, Through and through. He was the baby face, the all American hero. Kids loved him, fans loved him. So now we're getting to that part of WWE where who is going to take over, who's going to be the next, who's going to be the next big thing, if you will. They try to do it with Ultimate Warrior. They try to do it with like Lex Luger. They couldn't find that person to kind of take over. So now we're starting to kind of get into the whole Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels thing. Um, it's different because Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, their rivalry is still talked to this day. Probably one of the best, if not the best, rivalries out there. But the amount it's crazy to think that they actually liked each other before, and then there was some kind of blur between, obviously Shawn Michaels making a poke at Bret Hart, saying that he has some sunny days, and the sunny days was referring to what a woman that they had working. Her name was Sunny, thinking that Bret was having an affair, and that kind of was like ruining his marriage. So yeah, there was quite a bit of it. It was fun to watch. The rivalry. I mean, you talk about great matches. I mean, 60-minute Iron Man match where Shawn won. I mean, the list goes on and on. You can't talk too much about that rivalry, but the biggest one that they kind of talk about in the documentary was the Montreal Screwjob. The reason why that was that was such a big deal was because Bret Hart was champion at the time. He was kind of like the baby face, if you will, but they were going to go to Montreal for this match, and I think at the beginning, I can't remember. It's been a while, but Bret was supposed to drop the title, but he didn't want to drop the title to Shawn. And rightfully so. He didn't want to drop the title to Shawn, and especially in Montreal. I think he said he wanted to drop if he wanted to drop the title, it wouldn't have been to Shawn. He would have dropped it to somebody else. But there was also a big thing too with WCW being a big thing. This is where it kind of goes into episode 4, where it kind of talks about the Monday Night Wars. But yeah, this was a big thing back then because you got Bret, who was a champion, Shawn, the challenger, in Bret's basically home country, and he's supposed to drop the title. Obviously, they have the match. I can't remember, because I remember the referee being Earl Hebner. I can't remember if he was in on that. I think he was supposed to. I think all Vince did was tell him to ring the bell, saying that Bret tapped out to Shawn Michaels' version of the sharpshooter, which is Bret Hart's finisher. And it was crazy to see that as soon as Earl Hebner rung that bell, he just He got out of there. He didn't want anything to do with it. They were in Canada. He knew there was going to be blowback on that. But yeah, to see Bret lose like that in his home country, Shawn obviously winning the title, Bret Hart doing the WCW, because his contract was coming out and he was basically going to go to greener grass, if you will, because of all the bumps and bruises that he took for Vince. the crazy backyard, not backyard, but um, backstage, like the punch heard around the world where Vince went into the locker room and Bret Hart just kind of laid him out. So yeah, no, the third episode of the Screwjob really really was good. It talked about that. Then we start getting into probably my personal favorite episode, which was episode 4, where it talks about the Attitude Era. I mean, as a kid growing up in the '90s, where you had Monday Night Raw, you had Monday Night Nitro with WCW, and you had Monday Night Football, and it was just a great time to be a kid back then. I always made sure that my homework was done before like 7. That was so I can watch all 3 of these if I can. So if one was on commercial, I swapped to the other one. But this was the time to where now Vince is really, and WWE, they really got some competition. Eric Bischoff at the time was had a promotion with WCW, and then they were just winning in ratings. They of course they grabbed talent. Obviously, a couple of big ones were Lex Luger, Hollywood, Hulk Hogan, and the Outsiders with Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Oh, that was another thing I kind of wanted to bring up too, because I mean, obviously, we're talking about the Montreal Screwjob and the next big person after Shawn and Bret. But so before the Outsiders went to WCW, there was a big thing called kayfabe. Well, I mean, it's still relevant to this day, but it's called kayfabe, where you don't want the audience to kind of peek behind that curtain, if you will. So there was a match that happened. It was a live event, and it was basically a match between Shawn and Scott Hall, or Razor Ramon. I think it was Razor Ramon. But basically, they had the match, and then they basically had what was called the Click with Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, and they basically had, they were hugging each other, and obviously keeping with kayfabe, that doesn't work well. So, long story short, that kind of screwed Triple H out of winning the King of the Ring. He was supposed to win King of the Ring, and then that's when Austin 316 took over, and so that's when that happened. But yeah, no, WCW coming out with the Monday Night Wars. That was a big thing. For some reason, it's like WWE like took off, and then once WCW came out, then it's like some of the storylines, some of the characters were kind of tailored to kids even back then. So it just kind of, that's where WCW kind of took over. But then it really kind of picked up with with having like the Undertaker, and whenever I think of the Attitude Era, I really think of like Stone Cold Steve Austin, because I think without Stone Cold Steve Austin, it wouldn't have been as big. And then kind of give it up to Vince too for kind of creating his own character. I mean, obviously, the Mr. McMahon character. Everyone obviously hates their boss, and then for Stone Cold to kind of take over that role as that's what I liked about the Attitude Era. I always wanted to see what was going on with Stone Cold and Vince McMahon every Monday. It's like, is Stone Cold going to stun him this time? Is he gonna flip him off? Is he gonna drink a beer? Like what is he gonna do? But the Attitude Era, just especially with that whole Mr. McMahon character, and then you kind of bring that over, because I mean he brings Shane, he brings Stephanie. Brings the whole family in there. They kind of have their own characters. Triple H gets involved. The Rock. I mean, just everything about the Attitude Era. Undertaker. Just everything about the Attitude Era. Just it started really picking up from there. And then as WWE kind of was going up, especially with their own version of NWO, which was the D-Generation X. I'm surprised they didn't really talk about it really in this part, but there was an invasion with D-Generation X, um, into WCW. I'm actually surprised they didn't really talk about that too much. But yeah, no, the whole Attitude Era was just it was just good stuff to watch. Obviously, it was different times. It's no, obviously now it's the women's division, but back then it was the Divas. Um, and that's what I liked about whenever they brought Trish on to kind of talk about her part in the Mr. McMahon era character was basically whenever she was playing his girlfriend and things like that. Obviously, different times in the early to mid '90s. The women were looked at as more, objects and anything. Of course, they had their matches, but it was all about how they looked versus their actual talent. That's what I kind of obviously back then as a kid I liked it, but really kind of looking back on it now, like seeing the Divas division back then with Trish Stratus, Lita. They really had quite a bit of talent back then that actually would produce, 5-star matches. But yeah, obviously during the Attitude Era, the women were just looked at as more objects than anything. Yeah, no, the whole episode 4 of the Attitude Era was really good. That's what I grew up with, so I really did enjoy that. And then it kind of talks about. I'm actually kind of surprised, like once we get to the 5th episode of the documentary, that it really didn't kind of talk about when Shane bought out WCW, but it did talk about Vince buying out WCW and then kind of combining both entities with WWE, WCW. WCW just at the time was after the Monday Night Wars just kind of started trailing back as far as storylines go, characters. I think there was even a time where they had Rey Mysterio without his mask. There was just quite a bit of storyline. I think what was it? I think Goldberg had his streak broken by Kevin Nash out of all people. So once it started, like storylines started decapitating. They, it just kind of goes with that. But yeah, they talk about, that, and then once we kind of get into like the family business, things like that, we start to kind of go from the Attitude Era to like the Ruthless Aggression Era, which I really am glad that they kind of brought like people like John Cena onto the documentary, because it kind of talks about, because I mean John Cena, I mean just like how Stone Cold is with the Attitude Era, I can't think of the Ruthless Aggression movement without John Cena, mainly just because of how he came in there. But the family business with obviously acquiring WCW in WWE, and then we started to kind of get into this whole mixture of like the Ruthless Aggression Era, and Shane and Stephanie are becoming their characters again. Obviously, Mr. McMahon's still kind of there, but he kind of trails off a little bit, kind of focuses more on his family, But yeah, it really kind of gets into the Ruthless Aggression Era, and yeah, like I said, I can't think of that movement not starting out without John Cena. It's still crazy in my mind to think that had John not been on that bus that day that Stephanie was on it and able to basically do his rapping, because he was basically on his way out. They couldn't find a character, a storyline, something to kind of make him symbolize with the crowd. So he was basically on his own way out, and then that's where they created the Doctor of Thugonomics, and then the rest is history. So yeah, and then it does talk about some disturbing things, like especially if you're a wrestling fan, you kind of it's stuff that you don't necessarily like to talk about, but it's got to be said. So like, so obviously with the death of Owen Hart, that was a tragedy. It's actually crazy to think that out of all people, that was that was at an interview, that was at a pay-per-view, but the Godfather was actually supposed to be his opponent that night. So that was really interesting as a Blue Bomber. Um, yeah, it talks about Owen Hart's death. It still blows my mind that that night they continued the pay per view. I think the next match after the Owen Hart fight was supposed to be Undertaker and Stone Cold for the WWF title. Um, yeah, no, it's still blows my mind. It talks about Chris Benoit's death. How yeah, how that kind of came about. Yeah, that's that's a little bit of a sensitive subject, if you will. And then also another thing too that kind of how they were really kind of trying to blame Vince for all of these young deaths, if you will. Like we had people like Test, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit. I mean, the list goes on. They were trying to convince that they were convinced that Vince was basically the reason why these athletes are taking their own lives, or basically they were dying basically on his watch. And it's like, as a WWE superstar, you're basically on the road, pretty much almost 52 weeks, 365, 24/7. I mean, you're doing, maybe 2 or 3 shows a night, back then. Obviously it's different now, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure there may have been some, extracurricular activities that may have happened. But for them to kind of like point the finger at Vince, like, hey, you got all these superstars that are dying super young. I think Eddie was like 38 when he died. So yeah, it was really interesting to see. I mean, I give it up to Vince though for him having all these allegations, like even before then, and then obviously with the deaths. I still think that Owen Hart thing could have been done a little bit differently. They should have stopped the pay per view that night. Um, and then obviously, as we kind of get past the attitude, ruthless aggression, and kind of get towards the last episode of the series, um, it kind of talks about kind of more about the behind the scenes part. So obviously, other than just the allegations with Vince, but also how kind of like how the business is in Gorilla. So you got like Triple H. He kind of was on his. He was kind of retiring, so he was doing a little bit more stuff behind the scenes with Vince. Stephanie. That was another thing too. It kind of mentioned the relationship between Vince and Shane. How Shane it kind of was like the conversation that Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. had, with Vince and his dad, basically buying out the shares for WWE and kind of taking over. It was kind of almost the same thing with Shane, where Shane was going to buy, basically, because I think Shane and Vince kind of didn't really see eye to eye as far as like the creativity goes. So Shane was like, Vince was basically telling Shane like, hey, well then buy out from me, if you want to change things. Well, Shane didn't really do that, and he kind of left for some time, and then he came back, after quite a bit of years. But yeah, I do like to see that. I do like to see, kind of like the behind the scenes, because as a kid growing up, you don't see the backstage stuff. You don't see it like how you see it now, because back then we didn't have social media. We didn't know, kayfabe and all that other stuff. Like all of that was kept secret. Like probably one of the best examples I would say with kayfabe is Undertaker. I mean, he lived and breathed that character. He was dressed in black all the time. He rarely talked. He didn't really do anything, that wasn't outside of the Undertaker persona, if you will. So, yeah, no, it was crazy to see, like, because nowadays, heck, I think there's even people now like that know like the full match card. They know who's going to win. They know this person is scheduled to appear. Like it's crazy to think now. We pretty much can almost spectate and what's going to happen versus back then, where as a kid we didn't know what was going on. You know, hey, is this person getting surgery? That person got hurt. Was that the storyline thing? You know, so it was definitely different times back then. Um, yeah, no, so like the last episode, kind of, you know, obviously talking about the allegations again. The most recent one, the one that really kind of got Vince out of WWE with him selling his shares, um, and the way the WWE is now. I mean, it talks about, you know, Triple H, you know, the way he's kind of handling things. I mean, I got to give it up to Triple H. I mean, just for him to kind of take over the reins, and how he's doing with it right now. I think the product. I mean, this is just me. Everyone's got their own opinion. I think excluding the Attitude and the Ruthless Aggression era, the product is better than what it was before. I mean, it's skyrocketing in stocks. It's still got great talent. What I like from WWE now than what it was before was WWE now is kind of like more of a international entertainment because they got so much PLEs. They're in like Puerto Rico, Germany, Italy. There's quite a bit of I think I can't think of the streak now, but you know, there for a while they had like a streak of every PLE was, you know, in an international country. So, but yeah, I would say excluding the Attitude era and the Ruthless Aggression era, I think WWE is in a good spot with Triple H's leadership and the amount of talent they got. One thing that I did like that it was kind of talking about, and something that I could see why was kind of like the treatment of Roman Reigns, back because WWE is one of those. I wouldn't necessarily say sport, but it's definitely one of those athletic events. I don't know. That's just a term that I'm using here. But it's one of those things where people that watch it want things to happen organically. They don't want to be force fed. They don't want things shoved down their throat. They want things to happen as it should. And one of the things that Vince did quite a bit of was obviously the treatment with Roman Reigns, you know, trying to make him like the big dog, trying to make him a babyface, and people just didn't like it. And I mean, I've always been a Roman Reigns fan since the beginning. I liked him as the big dog. I love the Shield. But I definitely love what he's doing right now with the Tribal Chief character. I think it's definitely the hottest selling thing. I mean, every time I go to a WWE live event, and if it's SmackDown, the 5 to 10 minutes we get Roman out there is worth the ticket, in my opinion. Just because of the aura that Roman has now, especially with the bloodline. But yeah, it talks about, you know, the treatment of Roman. Definitely talks about kind of like the WrestleMania streak with Undertaker. So yeah, I would definitely recommend watching this documentary if you are as much of a wrestling fan. If you don't necessarily have to be like a WWE fan, just more of a wrestling fan like I am. I eat this stuff up. Like I said, the episodes are about an hour long. It's got 6 episodes, so give or take, 6 hours of watching. Definitely, like I said, definitely recommend it. I mean, everyone has their own opinion about Vince. But honestly, had it not been for Vince, we wouldn't have if it hadn't been for Vince, we wouldn't have WWE. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's gonna do it on this episode. Like I said, I definitely eat this stuff up. I hope there's more documentaries out there like this. Maybe not necessarily kind of like exposing people, but more just so like kind of like the behind the scenes. Like I love I love the Last Ride documentary with Undertaker, kind of talking about his last years in the business. I definitely love stuff like that. But I definitely hope that there's a little bit more documentaries on that. I do think it's kind of different that Netflix took over this one, but I guess it makes sense because Raw is now going to go to exclusively to Netflix starting next year. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I would definitely recommend watching this. It's definitely good in my opinion. I eat this stuff up. Kind of talks a little bit, the scandals, the talent, and just overall, it's good stuff. So, but I appreciate y'all listening. Hopefully, y'all enjoy listening to me kind of rant about wrestling, and I'll catch y'all on the next episode. Peace.
Funhouse active, king of the palace, rubber like Malcolm, balled up fist in the air to the flashlight, yeah, hands up in the air, they gun me down, I keep it 100, they crunching the numbers, I'm out. Young hitter got a fetish for success. If I ain't next, and I just leave impression. Next to rain on the window pane, puffin' plain Jane. Let them second guess me when I cop the Porsche with the